And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin, a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted a simple way to manage patches to Drupal core and your contrib projects? There's a Composer plugin for that. It's called Composer Patches, and it was created in April of 2015 by Cameron Wiggins. It is actively maintained. It has test coverage, and it actually has a documentation site as well as a markdown file in the repo to help you get started. There are only 10 open issues, 2 of which are bugs, which is pretty phenomenal considering it's been installed over 42 million times and it's approaching 43,000 installs per day, according to a recent blog post that we'll have linked in the show notes. Now, using the plugin is simple. You require cwiggins/composer-patches the same way you would a Drupal contrib project. The important difference is that Composer will ask you if you trust Composer patches to make changes to your code base. Once you grant that, the plugin is ready to start applying patches. You can specify what patches you want applied by adding patches in a section in the extra section of your project's composer.json file or by adding a patches.json file. Each patch can be specified using a URL or a path relative to the JSON file. And in theory, it's possible to have Composer patches pulled directly from the diff in a merge request on GitLab, but this is a significant security risk and should always be avoided. The first beta release for the 2.0 branch actually dropped support for dependency patch resolution, noting that it had become the source of most of these support requests that Cameron was dealing with. In the end, the community made it clear that they would resist upgrading without this capability, so the most recent Beta 2 release adds it back in. Finally, I should note that on his website, cwiggins.net, Cameron mentions that he's currently looking for full-time employment. So if your organization relies heavily on Composer in general or Composer patches specifically, consider reaching out to Cameron. So let's talk about Composer patches.
I have so much to say about this. I love this project, unironically, but it's always funny because the first time I add a patch to a project, I always forget that I need to include this, and I'm always like, why didn't that work? And then I remember. But I want to point out a couple of things. One is it's not just for core or contrib projects on Drupal. You can also patch any vendor project. So, for example, there's the Commerce UPS project right now by default does not work because one of the underlying library doesn't have PHP 8.2 support, I think, or 8 point, maybe even 8.0 support. So you need to patch the underlying library that module is using, and so there's ways to do that. So if you need to patch anything that is pulled in with Composer, you can use this plugin, which is fantastic. Another quick thing, something that I've been doing for a lot of my clients that has made this a lot nicer for me to maintain is whenever I'm patching a project, first of all, I only use local patches unless I'm testing a patch for the first time. But before I commit something, I make sure that the first section of the patch has a quick description of what it's doing, then a link to the issue on Drupal.org that it's resolving. And then if it's a patch file, the way I normally do it is I include the issue number. I then include, if it's a merge request, which most patches are now, I include the git hash for the commit that I've copied. Because that's the one thing that I kind of miss with merge requests is the nice thing about patches is you used to be able to be like, oh, this is patch 12, comment 12. And if it stops applying or something, you can look at the issue, you can be like, oh, there's been 4 patches since. It's a lot harder to do with merge requests to know if something has changed in the interim. So I've been attaching the git hash, and then I can just look at the merge request and see how many commits there have been since, and if I need to change it. I think that's the one thing that needs to be resolved with merge request is a way to like say this is a point in time that everybody's tested it's working. There's been changes since then, or there haven't been changes. But that's the way I've been kind of keeping my sanity with Composer patches, having a link to the issue, having the git hash, and then I can kind of do investigation if I need to.
So I also have an observation around this package, which I also a huge fan of and use it a lot. But there's an observation when you work in a larger team, when people find out that they can actually use patches, this is convenient. They can, fix the code that weren't working. But this makes it sort of tempting to fix this problem they encountered without reporting the issue and submitting the patch or these days on Drupal.org merge request to usually the open source project. And I tend to be very strict with people when they include local patches, because then it will not be obvious, did they also create a merge request or not? And then it's very useful to have that, as you mentioned, Nick, a reference to the original issue, which makes it more obvious if people either, neglected or forgot to create the issue, because we are building on top of open source software and we're doing it together after all. So it's a variation of with great power comes great responsibility, I believe.
The only time I've created a patch that I haven't contributed back was actually a module where I had to apply 4 patches to get things working, 3 of which were issues that I had created and pushed up on Drupal.org. So I had contributed those back. But it was a weird situation where the current dev for that module was broken. And my patches, even though they were against dev, they conflicted with each other because they were fixing slightly different things. And so I ended up having to create like a combined patch just for that project. And it would have been useless for other people. So, I didn't want to kind of create a muddied up thing. So it was kind of like a weird, unique situation where I had multiple patches for a particular client, for a particular project that had been contributed, but they conflicted with each other. And I couldn't just use dev or specific version because they were all broken. So I had a kind of a unique situation, but I agree. If you're writing a patch for a project, you should contribute that back to Drupal.org. Well, thanks, Martin. So how can folks connect with you or suggest a module of the week?
Nick, we're always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel in Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as Manclue in all of the Drupal or social platforms.